Okay.
Good old American voice.
Yes. Welcome to the next episode of an Evolving Man podcast. This is episode number 15, and I'm very excited to be speaking to Alistair Richardson today. So, Alistair specializes in helping people to heal from childhood trauma, codependency, and addiction, and empowering people to achieve success in their lives. He is passionate about supporting clients in breaking free from generational trauma. He's worked in some of the world's most exclusive addiction treatment centers. He's also been using EFT for over 20 years, which is emotional freedom techniques, to enhance the other therapies. He runs transformational survivors workshops for healing childhood trauma, and combines this therapy with SET and IEP, inner child work, and matrix reimprinting to support deeper healing and change. He specializes in using energy-based methods such as IEP and SET. We'll go over, you've got lots of different experiences: post-induction therapy, addiction counseling, psychology and MSc, matrix reimprinting, but and also you've worked um, as from the Pia Melodies model from Meadows for healing and resolving development and childhood trauma. And you now focus on Gaia Eternal Light Healing, and you are a flower essence practitioner. So welcome, Alistair. Real pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Piers. It's lovely to be here with you.
Mm. So today, so Alistair's speciality is, really with addictions, childhood trauma. And today's conversation, I'd love to go into speaking a bit more about addiction, but also relating it into boarding school syndrome. So one of the things we have in common is both of us went to boarding school. So I have lots of questions here. Um, so I'd love you to begin just to talk a little bit about your own journey into what drew you into doing the work you do now.
Well, thanks, Piers. So I think my journey began really with my childhood, where I came from a dysfunctional family, and my dad kind of left with the nanny when I was 4, and I blamed myself as 4-year-olds do. Didn't matter what my parents said to me, and uh, and then I was sent to boarding school when I was 7 by my mother in a very unskillful way, where she said to me, "Come and see this school, see if you like it. If you like it, you can stay." And we went to this school that was 5 hours drive from my house, and she showed me this school, and she said, "Do you like it?" I said, "Yes, but I don't want to stay." And she says, "Well, you are staying, and the bag's packed, you know." And in my trauma healing journey of my own, that moment was like a massive trauma for me, where because she was literally the last person I trusted in the world at that point, and suddenly, boom, abandoned. In boarding school syndrome, it talks about abandonment, betrayal, captivity, doesn't it? And
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't even remember that part of the memory for many years. I remember like saying goodbye to her, trying to keep my tears in, trying to keep her happy and caretake her emotions. I was just 7, and then I remember breaking down on the way up to the dormitory in the stairwell, just crying my eyes out, and I was completely heartbroken. Uh, for some other reasons I won't go into, I had the impression that actually my mum wanted me to kill myself or to die. So I had that, from another trauma that happened to me, I had that kind of layered in there as well. So then I was heartbroken at school, crying every night, to start with. But I learned big boys don't cry as a little kid. So people would say, "Who's crying?" And boarding school, they call you by your surname. So someone would say, "Oh, it's Richardson's crying." And I put on a brave voice and pretend it wasn't me and go, "Oh, yeah, own up, who's crying? It's not me." And then, but dissolve into tears again. So that was my kind of introduction to boarding school. And I was bullied by the teachers there. The headmaster's wife was really cruel to me. She used to pick on me and call me the devil and tell me stuff like, you pathetic, horrible little boy. You know, one time I was ill, I went to the nurse's station at night, and she was there in front of two other adults. She shamed me like that, and you know, I just burst into tears. You know, but in the end, I couldn't be vulnerable anymore. I had to kind of shut down all the vulnerability. I had one last attempt to get taken out of boarding school. I kind of was crying, and I found I had this little plastic box, and I thought, if I send these tears home to my mum, maybe she'll believe me how heartbroken I am, and then she'll come and take me out, you know. So I did that, and she never mentioned that to me, and I shut down after that. Any kind of, you know, all the worthlessness that I felt, that I thought I was obviously worthless if my mummy didn't want me, all that had to be shut down to survive, really. So I then became I call it an adapted child in the peer-malady model, where I was very rebellious. I had no empathy for others. I could be a bully and no feelings at all, you know, because I couldn't feel any shame, any kind of healthy shame, which is, you know, being humble if you do something wrong in front of others or make a mistake. I couldn't afford to feel any of that, because then I'd just feel the self-hatred and maybe potentially, you know, kill myself, who knows. So I also used to do this thing where I pretend, before I shut down like that, I pretended that I was in a film. I used to take myself to the toilet. There was a safe kind of place where I could just be by myself, and I'd pretend I was in a film. I'd been kidnapped. I'd wake up and go, oh, where am I? I don't know where I am. You know, maybe I've been kidnapped. And all I know now, all these were ways of trying to soothe myself and, well, medicate myself by not feeling my feelings and not having to really think about what had happened to me, you know. Big breath. So, you know, I've done lots of trauma healing stuff around that. And then I was very rebellious. I'd go out, I'd sneak out at night from the school. I used to call them ninja missions, you know, climb on the roofs. I used danger and fantasy in a way to kind of, again, take me out of the here and now. I got the slipper and the gym shoe and all that kind of physical abuse. And one teacher in particular used to pick me up and throw me around and scream at me and things like that, you know, full power. So that was my first boarding school. And by the time I went to my second boarding school at 13, I was smaller than I'm quite big now, 6 foot odd. But then I was, you know, I hadn't grown, and I got really badly bullied the first year there, called names and attacked in the dormitory by the other people in the dormitory. And in the end, another boy told the housemaster what was happening. And the way I kind of survived is I became a badass. You know, when I got bigger, I was then able to fight off these people. But also I started being like the scapegoat. You know, I was breaking all the rules, challenging the teachers and taking the mickey out of all the teachers. And in a way, that was, I know now, that was a way of empowering myself, you know, to, you know, not in a healthy way really, but it helped me again to cope. And I got a report that said Alistair is the naughtiest boy I've ever taught in my teaching career. And I was like, yes, you know, because at the time, that's what made me feel good, to be honest. And then I found alcohol. I was a squash player for Kent. I was number 2 in the school from the first time I was, you know, even when I was in the first year. As soon as I got drunk the first time, it was like a spiritual experience. Suddenly, I felt connected. I felt joy in my heart. I didn't care what anyone thought about me anymore. Excuse me. Yeah, and then I got really bad acne at school, so then I was teased for that. You know, so yeah, lots of trauma growing up, and I learned to medicate my feelings by dissociating, by fantasy, by then the alcohol came along and the drugs. You know, and in the end, I had addiction issues that I had to get into recovery from, based on that, you know. But as we talk about it later, it also set me up for dysfunctional addictive relationships with girlfriends and things like that. So, you know, fast forward to, I'm 19 years in recovery now. I tried to find a spiritual path to healing, because I was told the 12-step program is the way by my mum. so I wasn't going to do it the way she said. So I learned Reiki. I went to see gurus. I went to India to find enlightenment, but it was more of an addiction tour.
Yeah.
Like the flower essences, meditation, and in the end, I had to, I found recovery by working a 12-step program in my life.
Okay.
And then I've been helping other people in treatment centres. I'd already trained as a Reiki master. I was already a flower essence practitioner, trained in counselling, and then I was a care worker in a treatment centre that my mum sent me to when I was a teenager, which I left after 2 days. But anyway, I could go on for ages.
Wow.
But then they trained me as an addiction therapist, and I started training as a counsellor because I did all this stuff that was woo-woo, like the healing and the flower essences, energy medicine, and now I'm bringing all that stuff back into everything I do, which is wonderful. So I've worked. I suppose that's enough for now. So there we go.
Yeah, fascinating. I love your journey. I mean, I find it heartbreaking to hear your story at school, to hear, what happened. And in my own work, I hear so many stories like that. But it's very heartwarming to hear how you've recovered and how you now help others. So yeah, thank you so much for, taking that journey.
Well, one thing I wanted to really underline is, there's this great book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, where he was in the concentration camps in the Second World War, and his life was totally in other people's hands. His friends were murdered and they were starved and abused. And he realized in the end he had a freedom that no one could ever take from him. And that was the meaning he chose to give to his experience, And so I encourage other people to do that. But that's what I've done with what life brought to me, the challenges they brought to me. And now I help people who've been through that sort of thing. And it's been, in a strange way, a blessing, because I have compassion for people who've been through similar things, and I think there's a part of everyone that is not actually harmed by trauma. Maybe we call that the essential self, and embodying that and helping people connect with that is also part of what I do now.
Thank you. And I think it's very inspiring to see what you've been through, that we can come out to see that essential self that is not harmed by trauma. I was reading Peter Levine's book about the wild animals. When they release back into nature, they release, and if they are able to release that, then they can reintegrate, they survive. But if they don't have that chance to release the trauma, they don't survive. So it's fascinating, this work. So thank you for sharing. So I mean, one of the questions I kind of have as I was preparing this is, how do you feel addictions link into childhood trauma?
Well, I think there's a huge link between childhood trauma and addiction. And when treating addiction, like they do in the Meadows, which is where Peter Melody used to work, they actually start treating the childhood trauma at the same time as the addiction. So she now calls it developmental immaturity. So people end up having self-esteem problems. So they either think they're worse than others or better than others, and they have to make themselves feel valuable from the outside, either through attainment or being with this person or earning this much money or whatever it is, or being in control and more dominant than someone else. That's from childhood trauma. Problems with boundaries, protecting and containing ourselves, being behind walls rather than having healthy boundaries, so we can't have intimacy with people. A lot of people from boarding school, learn that one. And there's lots of different walls: a wall of silence, a wall of anger, so people are scared around someone, a wall of charm and seduction, a wall of humor. All these things kind of keep the individual away from themselves and get other people at a distance. Trouble with self-care, trouble with knowing what your needs and wants are, or being absolute refusal to ask for help. Anti-dependence, I learned that one. These are all the symptoms of, the effects of childhood trauma that people are powerless over. So this is what's underlying people's addictions. And I can talk more about that, but that's my first answer. And also a guy called Patrick Carnes, who's a very well-known name in the treatment of sex addiction in America. He did a study of over 1,000 sex addicts, and the more trauma they had as a child, the more different addictions they had. Because addictions, one of its purposes is to medicate our emotions or control our emotions.
Thank you. I don't know if you saw a few days ago Gabor Mate's film, The Wisdom of Trauma.
I've seen it advertised. I haven't seen it.
Right. I think it's still available to watch for free over the next day or so. And he talks a lot about that in the film, about emotions and addictions, and to do with the childhood trauma. The more childhood trauma you have, the more the chances are that you're going to struggle with addiction. So, so thank you. I mean, so for you, when you're working with someone with addiction, I mean, is there a certain protocol that you follow in order to help support them? Because obviously you've had your own journey. What's worked for you, and what works for the people you work with?
Well, the protocol is, the first thing to do is to help the person stop acting out on their addiction, whatever it is. So there's no point trying to help someone get over their addiction if they're still smoking crack or drinking alcohol or gambling addictively, because that will just numb them out and make them unavailable. So the first stage is to get the person abstained from their drug. One definition of addiction, there's lots of them, is a pathological relationship with a mood altering chemical or behavior. So if it's a behavioral addiction, like sex, like exercise, like there's even one called compulsive helping, where people run around helping everyone else to make themselves feel better, either in a dominant way or in a self denial type way, which destroys their lives. So it's about abstinence from that first of all. But before then, of course, it's assessing that, what is their addiction? So when I worked at the Priory, people would come in with, they think, right, I'm an alcoholic, or I'm this, and we'd do a cross addiction questionnaire with them, and which covers relationships, sex and love addiction, gambling, shopping and spending, there's just a few, prescription drug addiction, workaholism, and see what is their addictive pattern, and let's get some boundaries in there to help the person not be acting out on those. And then we can go deeper underneath the addiction to start working on helping that person learn how to have and feel and experience their feelings, how to be relational, healing the childhood trauma stuff. So that's the starting point. And some people have never thought they had they come into treatment or one-to-ones, and they don't even think they've got an addiction. And by the time they leave, right, now I know I'm an addict, so I'm just not going to do it anymore. And they're absolutely determined and adamant they won't do it anymore. But there's lots of models of addiction, but a nice simple one is there's three parts to it. There's the physical part. Once you have one of this thing, or once you do one addictive activity, you have little or no control over how much you then do. It sets up a craving you can't control. Yeah. The part that affects the mind is, you can be obsessing about something addictive, which is also medicating emotions anyway. But your mind will lie to you and tell you it's okay to do it this time. It will be different. No one will know. I like to use that denial, don't even notice I'm lying. So the person lies to themselves. So, and it's very hard to remember how bad it was last time. And people with addiction tend to remember the good times. So there's a mind that tricks you back into the addiction. But then the third part is often called things like self-centeredness or self-will. It's the idea that the person with addiction absolutely knows best what's right for them, and they're going to do what they're going to do, No one else is going to tell them what to do. I want to do what I want to do. So these people might leave certain that they're going to stay in recovery now because they've never even seen a problem, and they're just not, because they need a support network, you know. So it's about assessing and identifying the addiction, helping the person find abstinence, learn new strategies for dealing with the emotions, which is where I bring in tapping and stuff as well, which I'll mention, and then helping them build a support network. Things that in most of the treatment centres I've worked in, it is actually referring people to the different 12-step fellowships, which are free. Like, you know, there's one for every addiction you can think of, where there's a group of people who are in recovery, living a certain way of living, a spiritual way of living, following certain principles, who help others as part of their recovery. And we refer people to those and encourage them to go to those. So, and then to actually work that program, the 12-step program. Now, some people have a problem with that because it's got the word God in it, and it's like, oh, it's a religion. And it's, you know, part of my job is to say, no, it's nothing to do with religion. The word God, you can choose what it means to you. It can be any power that's greater than your addiction, really. You know, because when people come in for treatment, their addictions are power greater than them. They can't stop it however much they want to. Oh yeah, and so that I can talk about this happening now or later.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Well, like I said, I use the emotional freedom technique and matrix imprinting, but what I've learned with working with clients is if I do a session where I teach some EFT and I get them to tap on themselves, they don't do it on themselves after that, because it's like, oh, I didn't know what to say. I got confused about the points. So I use Steve Wells and David Lake's simple energy techniques, and now intention tapping from Steve Wells, where you get the person to learn just to tap on the points whilst focusing on the problem. If they feel fear in their stomach, they just focus their awareness there and tap, and then notice the next thing, like this, on these points. And this one's on the hand that you can do easily with your thumb. So you can use that to deal with problems like from the past, or worries about the future, or limiting beliefs like I'm bad, I'm worthless. But what they found as well is that's all directed way of using tapping. There's a general way of doing it where you don't actually focus on anything in particular, you know, because they were running a workshop where a lady had a phobia of snakes. They did loads of tapping over the 3 days. This is in Australia. On the 3rd day, they went out and some guy had a snake around his neck for a tourist opportunity to take photos. And this woman goes, "Oh my God," in an Aussie accent, "my snake phobia is gone. Get that snake around my neck," you know? And they reviewed the workshop and no one had thought about or mentioned snakes or phobias the whole time. So just tapping enough cleared a phobia. So I now teach my clients to tap for an hour a day based on what I've learned from them. Just like now I'm tapping, you know? Just while you're on a Zoom call, while you're reading a book, while you're walking, that's starting to empty out your stress and trauma bucket, and you're much more likely to remember to tap when you need to, like if you have a trauma reaction and anxiety, anger, whatever it is, because you're doing it as a habit anyway. So that's what I teach, and then I teach intention tapping, which brings in another dimension. But there's one more thing about trauma I'd like to say, if that's okay.
Go for it.
You know, when we have a trauma, we regret a trauma reaction that's unresolved. We regress when it's triggered to like we're the same. It's like we're the same age as when the thing happened. You know. Now, what I learned from Pia Melody in particular, with sort of relational trauma as a child, up to the age of 6, it just tends to wound us, and we can't really think about what's going on. And then we call that the wounded child parts of us. And then we learn to adapt and take on certain roles where we parent ourselves the way we've been parented. Like me saying, it's not okay to cry, big boys don't cry, to myself at boarding school. That was my adapted child. Me kind of shutting down and being rebellious and no empathy. And that was another adapted part of me, whatever we call that. And in a part, an echo in a child. So when I go one up or one down, which is a self-esteem issue, If I think I'm better than you, or I'm criticizing and attacking myself, or I'm feeling less than or worth less, it's actually a trauma reaction. I'm regressing. And I need to be, that sabotages people's recovery from addiction. Because if you don't trust anyone, if you're anti-dependent, you won't ask for help. If you think you know it all, you're better than them, or you're worthless, why would they help me anyway? I don't want to ask for help because they're going to be busy. It sabotages people's recovery, the childhood trauma thing. So,
and what can they do in that instance? Is it just to do the tapping?
The first step is when they notice they're going one up or one down.
One up or one down, yeah.
The first stage is awareness. So there's the 3 A's, like awareness, acceptance, action. So, I've gone one up, like in a mindfulness meditation. My mind's drifted. I'll gently bring it back. Well, on these workshops, we teach people to be a loving parent to themselves. So it's like functional parenting is all 3 different types of love. Affirming the child is valuable just for being themselves, not like you're a bad boy or a good boy because of this. We love you anyway. That's not okay what you're doing. And I'm proud of you, even though you came last, I still love you. That kind of parenting is affirming. Nurturing the child is meeting the child's needs and helping the child learn to meet their own needs and wants. And setting healthy limits, protecting the child and setting healthy boundaries for the child, which is also discipline, healthy discipline. The opposite of that is criticizing and attacking a child, abandoning and neglecting a child, or indulging the child so they're allowed to do whatever they want with no limits, or setting impossible limits. So if you're 5, you're told not to be noisy or clumsy, it's impossible because you're 5, unless you're terrorized into it. That would be too intense a limit. Or inconsistent limits. Today this is okay, tomorrow it's not okay. So the idea is, through doing the inner child work and the tapping and releasing the trauma, that you learn to start affirming myself rather than criticizing myself, nurturing myself rather than abandoning and neglecting myself in the here and now, setting healthy limits for myself rather than indulging. But the first stage is awareness, and the tapping helps because it brings you into the here and now. It calms the amygdala. But again, because it's a relational wound, I don't think you can just do it by yourself. I think you need to, the workshops you're witnessed by other people doing the healing, and you learn from them, or doing it with a therapist, and then you learn to do it for yourself. But on the deepest level, that essential self, whatever we want to call that, once, if I'm doing some work with someone to help them have self-esteem, and we say, what's good qualities about you and what does other people think about you here? And they're told, right, we think you're honest and you're loving, and they've got an inner voice going, no, you're not, you're this, you're really dishonest, in your whole relationship with your wife. That's not true. That's one of these adapted parts, trying to help in a dysfunctional way, that person. And if you ask that part to step out of the person, or the person says, step back and relax, or please step out of me, suddenly they can accept these things. Suddenly they've got self-esteem. So on the deepest level, we've got this wholeness where we do the healing from, but some people just need help to connect with that and learn how to do it,
Thank you. That reminds me of what you were saying at the beginning, this idea of this whole self that that we can heal from trauma.
From that place.
Thank you.
And so sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm making notes, but it's like, oh wow, yeah. This is great. Thank you.
So then the acceptance is accepting yourself when you realize I've just gone one up or one down, and then the action, whether it's inner helping yourself or asking for help to help yourself, or
Thank you. I mean, is there a place? I mean, I know you do workshops, and I think you did one. Was it last weekend or the weekend before, that 3-day?
I did a 3-day one privately with my colleague, and I do them still for North London Priory. So I did one of theirs last week. For 5 days. Yeah.
Is there a kind of a resource page where people can look at, or just be guided through? Where would someone learn about, these steps you're talking about?
Well, there's a great book, and I think it's called Who Are You Calling an Addict by David Smallwood. I know it's by David Smallwood. And it's something like, who are you calling an addict, or me an addict, and it covers addiction, and underneath this idea of the childhood trauma. So he's got quite a good overview in that book of what needs to happen if you've got a serious addiction. Because we could say everyone's got an addiction to a degree, but it's when it's destroying your life, and other people's lives, or when you're just dying on the inside, that people often seek help at that time, or when they're forced into it by loved ones. There's a book I'll kind of text you later that's been written recently about the peer melody model way of healing trauma and living that way, but I just can't remember the name of the book.
No worries. What I'll do is I'll put this into the description, so so people want to go below the description now.
And sorry to hold back. No. Facing Codependence by Peer Melody and Facing Love Addiction by Peer Melody are good to read as well, because it talks about the addiction and the developmental immaturity, she calls it now, and then how it can operate in relationships.
Thank you. Because I was reading Gay and Katie Hendricks' book, Conscious Loving, this morning, talking about codependency. And that's something I've come across a lot in my own work with boarders. This idea they really struggle in relationships. And I don't know if you found this yourself, is it's not something we were educated really as boarders about how to be in relationship. We didn't have our parents around us. The model, well, this is how you react. This is how you respond in relationship. So it's definitely something I've seen in my own work that we really struggle. So it's interesting you talk about codependency or our struggles in relationship.
Yeah, and in their definition in that book, they say it's an addiction to control and approval, from what I remember. Right. Peer Melody's, but now she calls it, because there's so many different definitions of codependence. Now she calls it developmental immaturity. So but when you're sent to boarding school, it's a bereavement. And there's no support emotionally. So you're abandoned, one, by your parents, or whoever sends you there. Two, you're abandoned emotionally. So you learn to abandon yourself. If you're criticized and attacked, you learn to criticize and attack yourself and or others. And the same with the abandonment thing. And the same with indulged. If you're indulged or set too intense limits, then people do it to themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the things I did on my first year at boarding school, is that I realized it was so much better for me to be attacked and hated by myself, because that was just one person, compared with 20 people in a dormitory setting, them all having a go. It's like, oh, I much prefer just the hatred coming from me. And so, that's definitely something that I did and spent many years kind of undoing.
Yeah, me too.
So I'd love to come back to some of the questions. So you've answered kind of a few of the ones there. So kind of moving on to the next question is about some addictive behavior is more socially acceptable than others. For example, overwork is often seen as a virtue, and the person with the addiction to overwork can easily judge others as less committed or even less valuable as human beings. Do you have any advice for those trying to understand and change this destructive pattern of addictive behavior?
Absolutely. So workaholism is also about compulsive busyness. So it's not necessarily, someone might say, well, I only work like 50 hours a week or 45 hours a week, but they're always on their phone checking work. They're always keeping themselves busy. They're doing the DIY at home. And all that is avoiding, again, their emotions, their reality in the here and now, their thoughts and feelings. And so first of all, with a behavioral addiction, again, it's about what is healthy work for me and what is addictive and compulsive work for me. So I'd get someone to, to kind of work that out in collaboration, and to make sure they're having breaks and things like that, and then that's what they commit to doing, and to be accountable to someone. This is why you need a support network to recover from addiction. It's virtually impossible without one, because we need someone to be honest with and accountable to, so we can go, okay, I know I said I wouldn't work through my lunch break, but I did today. And then someone says, okay, so what's going on? Why do you think that is? Oh, it's an emergency at work, it's a one-off. Or, oh, I just kind of fancied working through today, or I was really stressed and I thought, and then it's like, okay, so. But again, I think workaholism, often underlying it is the sort of perfectionism, workaholism thing, where it's the other esteem, because that person hasn't got self-esteem. And a statement of self-esteem is, I have inherent worth. It cannot be raised by my strengths or lowered by my defects of character. If you haven't got that, you've got to make yourself feel valuable in other ways. So work, so I earn this much money or this much status, or, that's often underlying. So that might need addressing. And I would send them to Workaholics Anonymous as well. Okay. To get, or it doesn't have to be a 12-step fellowship. It's a support network. I think you do men's groups, and there's other groups available where you could get support. Some people do it with a therapist, but often that's not enough of a support, and they're not available like a support network can be available.
Yeah, I do see that more and more community, and I think this last year with lockdowns and things like that, we've had less access to face-to-face communities, and I've really noticed people struggling because they've wanted that connection with people and they've not had it, especially the younger people. So yeah, that I see that over the last year, the importance of community. It's like, yeah, having those spaces and those people we can speak to, or we can call at any given time.
And if you get friends in America, you can ring them in the middle of the night and it's no problem.
Who's that?
Well, often people will say, oh, I couldn't ring someone because it was 2 a.m, I didn't want to wake them up. If you've got contacts in America, you can ring them in the morning at 2 and it's like in the day over there.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good idea. Thank you. So obviously, I mean, the next question is, have you noticed a correlation between borders and patterns of addiction?
Well, I assess, in the places I've worked, everyone's assessed individually anyway. But if I was to say some of my experience of what I've noticed, there's love addiction and love avoidance, which I haven't mentioned. I've mentioned it, but I haven't really explained that. So when you've been abandoned by a parent, and remember, you can be abandoned by a parent who's there the whole time. It's not obviously the case with boarding school. People have been to boarding school. If they're shut off from their emotions, they abandon their child emotionally. If they're in hospital for a long time, they abandon the child because they're just not there. It's not about the intention, it's about the impact on the child and the beliefs they take on. So, I would say the workaholism one, the love addiction, love avoidance. I was saying about love addiction. So when you believe you're worthless, then you tend to put people on a pedestal. So it might be your girlfriend or boyfriend, or even a friend or your boss. If you've been abandoned by that sex parent, that gender parent, you put them on a pedestal, and you think you're less than and they're better than, which is delusional. It's not true. It's a fantasy. And you go into this relationship in a haze of fantasy, and it can become very much like an addiction for people. And then, of course, they'll choose someone who's not available for intimacy, because the conscious fear of someone with love addiction is abandonment. The unconscious fear is intimacy, because if you really knew me, you would leave me because I'm worthless. So a love addict doesn't actually really want intimacy, although they think they do, someone with love addiction. The love avoidant as a kid is often the one who has to be a caretaker for their parents. They learn that they're valuable by looking after other people. I had that I was told you're the man of the house now when I was 5, by my mum, and various other stuff she told me when I was a teenager, like I was her supervisor for her very traumatic work, you know. So then you get put on a pedestal in a way by your parent, but abandoned at the same time covertly. So you learn it's my job to look after needy people, but if you get too close, I'm going to die. I'm going to get suffocated, because it's like a trauma reaction. It's like I'm that little 5-year-old again. I don't know how to look after my mum. I'm only 5, you know. So a love avoidant meets a love addict. Talking about boarding school, I think you can do both. You can have love addiction and love avoidance. Love avoidance, you're behind walls. You look for intensity outside the relationship. You don't want the person too close. The love addict's all needy, wanting the person really close. You know, they bounce off each other. I'm trying to do like an hour's lecture in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But that's, so that's a problem. Maybe sex and porn addiction would be a big one. Maybe exercise addiction, but the addiction, the one thing I want to teach is the addiction goes with the person. It's not about this chemical or that behavior. It's about this person, they've learned these ways of coping, and now it's gone out of control, and if that one stops, they'll find another way, unless they do the inner healing and connect to that central core of wholeness, and love.
Thank you, Alistair. And do you find when people go into the earlier memories, so something Joyce Everin does is, taking people into those boarding school memories until they're neutralized, and that's similar to the work with EFT or matrix reimprinting. Do you find once somebody neutralizes in that way those earlier traumatic memories, do you find then the addictions are able to be let go of, or does there something more needs to happen?
Well, I think definitely healing those earlier memories and those younger parts of ourselves. In matrix imprinting, you kind of go in and, as you release that part of yours trauma. You help them change the memory so it's empowering for them and changes their belief to an empowering belief, and that's kind of integrated into the heart. In the post-induction therapy, you kind of go in and get that younger child from the memory into the here and now with you and do healing and reparenting work with that part of you. And then when you've discharged their trauma, you put them in your heart, and but sometimes the problem is that the part is in them now. So if I'm one up looking down on you, I'm my 17-year-old self right now. It's not my adult self here. I need to get him out of me in the here and now and do that healing work, setting him limits, affirming him, nurturing him, clearing his trauma, bringing in healing, sending love and healing in, or courage or peace once the trauma's gone, and then integrating into the heart. So it's very much a relationship with self. So yeah, once you've done enough of that, it's much easier to be free from addiction and stay in recovery. But once you're you're addicted to something, I would say abstinence is just the way forward. No one tries to say to us, nicotine smoker, try controlled smoking, once you've done all your trauma healing work. To me, my experience is that people have to be abstinent, from the addictive part of the behavior, if it's a behavior, or, even with alcohol, you're still drinking, you're just not drinking alcohol anymore. You're just taking out the addictive part. Do all the trauma healing, you've happily, easily remain in recovery, but I don't think you can learn to control an addiction thing once you've got to a certain level, Does that answer you?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. It just reminds me, bringing in my own story, as my father was an alcoholic, and at age 5 he spent a year in hospital with cirrhosis of the liver. And at that point he was told he couldn't drink anymore. If he did, he would die. But I always felt he was in the house then because he was invalided out of the Navy. I still felt that he was an addict, but he just didn't drink anymore.
Yeah.
And so that kind of makes sense as you say that yeah, he still needed to do those, that healing in order to release his addictions in other ways.
Yeah, and you can be addicted to, you're powerless over raging, and rage is like an addiction for someone, so they call it like the dry drunk or untreated alcoholism, even though the person has stopped drinking. The alcoholism is still there, the addiction is still there, the inner drug store is still there. There's a fellowship as well, by the way, for people who've had trauma as a child. There's Co-Dependence Anonymous that I send people to, or ask them to go to, I should say. And there's ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics and or Dysfunctional Families. And this is, again, a fellowship, a network of people that can help you heal from your childhood trauma, whether or not you've got an addiction,
Thank you. That's really good to know that there's those things out there. Thank you, Alistair. So, another question I have is, I know you've worked at the Priory from time to time, so this question is, at the Priory, do they get ex-boarding school people with addictions, which you kind of answered before? I think you've really answered this, actually. What sort of addictions do people have? You've kind of said that.
Well, I've just thought about another answer to the last question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So just jump in with that. Now, with intention tapping, which I'm an intention tapping practitioner, the Steve Wells's theory, he was reading a book by Byron Katie, who is a bit like an Eckhart Tolle type person who just awoke one day with no suffering anymore, and she helps other people. And he read this statement, it's not our thoughts that cause our suffering, it's our attachments to our thoughts. And he thought, why don't I use that as an intention statement? I release all of my emotional attachments to X, Y, or Z, and then just tap and notice what you notice. And he developed some other ones, like I restore the right energy flow to my stomach. If you've got a tension or a fear in your stomach, or to this fear. And there's a few of these intention statements, and his theory so far is we've got our conscious mind, which is like the tip of the iceberg. We've got our unconscious mind, which is like the iceberg under the sea, and the sea is what he calls the unconscious mind. I might call it something else. You might, but that's that part of me that I'm talking about, the whole part that's fine, that's one with life, and that's where the healing comes from with intention tapping. So yes, we can go back to memories. If I feel less than, how old do I feel right now? I might say to a client, how old do you feel? Well, I feel 7. Where's your 7-year-old self? Is he inside you, outside you, or back in time? And then we work with wherever the 7-year-old is. That's kind of quite, although we're following where the energy leads, it's still quite a conscious way. I need to work on my abandonment stuff. Yes, we follow the energy with matrix reimprinting. But with intention tapping, it's almost like that part of us is guiding what comes up. So I'll just use a mundane example. I was trying to get myself to jog, and I was resistant to it. And so I release all of my emotional attachments to jogging regularly. And I just started tapping. You just tap, and you notice what arises next mindfully. And the next thing that arose was when I was at boarding school, my first boarding school. We would do sports every day, unless it was Monday to Friday, unless it was terrible weather, like a snowstorm or a blizzard or bloody whatever, torrential rain. And then we'd go on a cross-country run. So I was like, that part of me, that younger part of me said, I'm not going for a run. There's no way. So I had to do in the child work with him, or I had to say, you can use these statements with these younger parts. I release all of his emotional attachments to not going for a run and to all the reasons why, and I found that to be a wonderful way of working with people that helps them connect to that big S self. Sometimes to be asked that the right healing energy to your 5-year-old self, and then they'll say, oh, he's got arm around him now, or he's in a rainbow, So that's that's another way of finding what needs to be worked on, you know, and just working with it, and then guided by what I think a higher intelligence than just our conscious mind, you know.
Thank you. It's interesting, the iceberg analogy. I've kind of had a similar idea recently, which I've been using, but I won't go into it now. Exactly the same thing, the iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg being, you know, if we bump into something consciously, it's like, but there feels such a weight, and that's kind of the unconscious. So I like the analogy of the sea as well. It's like, oh, that's fascinating. I've not thought about that.
It's not very heavy from that perspective, you see.
Yeah, definitely. So, so I mean, that going back to that question, kind of this idea at the Priory for people ex-boarders, do they tailor their treatment any differently for these people? And if so, how do they help these people? And does the addiction treatment work?
Well, all the treatment centres I've worked in, and when I work by myself, I've also worked in these ones like Rosegloss Island, which is, as a living therapist, you know, it's much more kind of high end. That person has a whole team working with one person at a time. But wherever I've worked, it's always tailored individually to the individual. Or most places I've worked, certainly at the Priory, they do that, North London Priory. So no group would be dealt with as a group, that each of them would be dealt with individually, because there'd be differences with all the boarding school survivors as well, if that was, you know. So they, you know, so it's a kind of yes and no answer to that one. And does it work? It certainly works. There's a saying, it works if you work it, you know. If someone's got a lot of willingness and is willing to follow suggestions, and, you know, then it works, you know, very effectively. But sometimes people's trauma stuff sabotages them, you know, which is why the trauma healing stuff has to happen as well, and the childhood trauma healing has to happen as well. Because if you have one of these trauma reactions where you become 7 again, you don't remember, I need to ring someone rather than pick up my addiction, or I need to do this. It's like, I'm 7 again, or I'm that rebellious teenager again. One of the things I just want to say, because there's evidence, you know, I think you can find evidence for anything. There's evidence that some people, you know, a lot of people just seem to just get over their addiction and they don't drink anymore, and they didn't have any treatment or anything like that. But for me, in my experience, I've worked over 1,000 people with addiction at least, they'll be doing something else addictive if they haven't done the healing, you know. So they might have stopped drinking by themselves, but, you know, like you mentioned with your dad maybe, but they're still, you know, they're compulsively doing this, or they're doing that, or they're, you know, compulsive avoidance of stuff is addictive as well for people. You know, you get people who are anorexia, compulsive, or sexual anorexia, or social anorexia, where, you know, someone won't do anything where they can be nurtured, because it's compulsive, because it's, again, they're in control of their emotions. So yeah, it works if you work it, I would say. And obviously helping people want to work it if they don't want to. And, you know, some people, the first place I worked called Promise, they did a study of comparing people who were sent to treatment against their will, as it were, because they were going to get thrown out of the family home unless they went into treatment, or went of their own free will because they wanted to. Their outcomes after a year were very similar. Because in treatment, you help the person get to that motivation. You know, that's part of the job of the therapist. You know, see the damage about the protocol, really see and feel the damage the addiction's been causing. Like, get the family involved, where they might write a consequence letter. This is what you did when you drink, and half the time they don't even remember what they did. And it's like a sledgehammer, and it's like, boom, now they're ready to maybe to embrace a new way of living, free of the addiction. I'm on a bit of a roll, so
Yeah,
I'll
that's
stop there.
great. I mean, we've got probably about 10 minutes
Okay.
left. I mean, um, yeah, no, I really thank you for for that. I kind of makes a lot of sense. I probably ask lots and lots of questions because it's an area I'm fascinated by. I
And
mean,
sorry, again, just to jump in, the family often has to be involved because the person with the addiction often plays a role in the family
mm,
where they're the bad one and everyone else is trying to help them and they don't have to look at themselves at all.
mm,
And so I'd run the family group at the Priory. And first thing is to get the person's attention off the person with the addiction onto themselves and
mm,
say, well, why have you been accepting what is unacceptable to you? What's that about you? How can we help you with that? How can we stop you obsessing about trying to help the person with the addiction and get on with your own life and just set these healthy limits with the person with the addiction? So if they relapse, this is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. You know what you're going to do. And then you don't have to worry about them. They're on their journey. And the message is that you help the person with the addiction in any choice they make towards life and recovery. And you don't help them in any choice they make towards addiction and death.
mm,
But again, people need a support network to do that because it's really hard to do that with someone you love,
mm. Is
because
there a book they can read or some resources family members can be guided to?
well, again, you can read the literature of all these fellowships. There's Al-Anon and Families Anonymous.
Mm,
There's COSA for the love, the partners of sex addicts, COSA. There's the Codependence Anonymous stuff,
mm,
Uh, if I think of any particular books,
mm.
I'll send them along to be put in the notes, if that's all right, Piers.
Yeah, great, great. Thank you, thank you.
But sometimes unconsciously the family want the person to relapse because
Mm,
they don't have to change. It's out of awareness. No one's consciously thinking, I want my loved one to relapse. But actually it's kind of the way the status quo.
yeah, 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 yeah. I think reading that in Gay Hendrix's book, Katie Hendrix's book this morning, often on the codependence, the other partner might not have the addiction, but it keeps them stuck because it's I guess on one level it keeps them, they can be the rescuer, or so they need to do their work as well. So thank you. Um so um the next question I have is so a lot of these are about kind of boarding school, but is it harder for boarding school people to even admit to having an addiction, given that weakness in that culture is almost taboo?
Absolutely. So I think most people with an addiction have this thing called anti-dependence.
Mm,
So, if you have to, like in boarding school, you have to be strong and not vulnerable. You learn you've got to rely on yourself. Uh, and because the child has been shamed by being abandoned or criticized and attacked for needing help or being vulnerable,
mm,
even to ask for help will trigger a shame attack or a shame bind, it's called in the PMLity model, where that person suddenly feels great worthlessness.
mm,
So for a lot of people, not just boarding school people, but definitely boarding school people, they would feel great shame that they're weak if they were to ask for help
mm,
or say, look, I feel like I want to go and have a drink right now. And what we say is, like, start picking up the phone every day and ring people, 2 or 3 people a day, just to check in your support network. So you start, and obviously you can do the therapy to heal that part of them that feels the shame. The legacy of childhood trauma as well is not only have we got our own wounded parts, we're carrying the generational,
mm,
if a major caregiver is raging or suppressing their anger, the child soaks up some of that anger. And then in the here and now, something happens that triggers anger. We've got our adult anger. We can have empathy as an adult. We've got our inner child anger if it's unhealed. And the carried anger that's often experienced as rage. If the person hasn't offloaded that, all that's going to stop that person asking for help and having a shame attack. So literally I've done a whole session before I'll make someone ring someone in the session with me, whilst tapping, exposure therapy, because it's like such resistance. Yeah. It's just another healing opportunity, eh?
Yeah. So do you recommend in that moment you call someone or you tap? It's like you have that trigger come up.
Well, like with the craving, tapping and following the energy. So where is it in the body? What color is it? What shape? When's the first time you felt like that? Or the intention tapping, so you're clearing the fear or the resistance or the shame before doing it. And then they can be tapping whilst doing it if they agree to do it.
Yeah.
It's great for phone calls, stressful phone calls. You're doing this underneath or Zoom. Yeah. So there's lots of ways of doing it. But it'll be a younger part. It'll be going one up or one down. You see, if they're not going to ring, why wouldn't you ring and ask for help if you need help? As a kind of grown up, it's just logical, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you, Alistair. So, and the next one is wondering if you have views on what patterns of addiction are more likely during or after boarding school. I mean, you've kind of answered some of them: love addiction, love avoidance, workaholism, but is there specific ones more likely?
Well, it's quite, there's compulsive helping. I'll just mention these, so in the Promise Shorter questionnaire, there's a compulsive helping, submissive and dominant, and there's relationship submissive and dominant. And this is definitely to do with all the childhood trauma in my clinical experience. So always having to be in control in your relationship where you've got the power, or always kind of being subservient, which by the way is just as controlling as it's called negative control in the PMLG model. You're manipulating to get your needs met if you're the people pleaser, subservient one, or dominant. I would suggest more the dominant one would be there from boarding school in a lot of people. And maybe the compulsive helping where people are the caretakers of others, but I'm not so sure about that one. It's anything that person's learned medicates their emotion, And by the way, someone with an addiction, not just people with addiction, they find it hard to sit with their feelings. It's not only their so-called negative feelings they find it hard to sit with. If they're feeling joy and I say, right, where do you feel the joy? Just sit with that joy. What color is it? Breathe into that joy. They're like trying to get away from the joy because they can't cope with that either. It's like the feeling realm is kind of shrank down. In recovery, it's like expanding the capacity, so we can feel more,
Interesting. I've always seen boarding school, it's almost like a flat line, and maybe that's childhood trauma. It's a flatline experience. Certainly boarding school, maybe this is true for also a lot of childhood upbringings. If you're too happy, you got shamed, certainly at school, what are you doing? You're happy. Yeah. What's wrong with you? You're gay. It's like, or if you were too depressed, it's like, oh, what's wrong with you? You're miserable. So it was almost, we had to become flatline. So what's the things that you do in recovery to help people move those windows, those thresholds?
Well, again, the awareness, acceptance, action. So body scan, like the mindfulness, becoming aware of the body. There's an exercise called a body map where you get someone, they ask a friend or someone else in treatment to draw around their body, literally the whole size of their body, and they start drawing on their body map, where do you feel anger then, or where's the damage from your addiction on your body, where's, I've got a big scar on my leg from an accident when I was a kid. I would draw that on there. And what feelings do you feel when you think of that? Let's say I still felt feelings about that, anger and shame or fear. You draw in on your body anger, shame, and fear there. So it helps someone start to really connect with their body, because a lot of people with addiction, they do this, and you say, can you feel your hand, without moving their hand. They can't feel it because they're not in their body really. Their awareness is well out of there because there's so much pain in there, which is again a legacy of trauma often in childhood. So yeah, things like that, here and now, what, yeah, that's the main. I think the somatic experiencing stuff of using a shower on the body, so you just feel different parts, can help with connecting with the body and the emotions in the body. That's it. In the body, get them into the body is what I do. Yoga.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Bessel van der Kolk, in one of his talks, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, he was saying they set up this thing post 9/11. All the therapists decided we'll get people in to do CPD. Is that right?
Continuing professional development.
No. What are my things? Basically, to get them in to do talk therapy, and they ended up, very few people came to these sessions. And so eventually he did some studies to say, well, what did you do? And the main thing was, I think, acupuncture, then yoga and exercise and massage. These were the ways people dealt with the stresses. So yeah, it's interesting. Those things for getting us more into the body are actually the things that, like that somatic experiencing.
And havening, self-havening, where you're stroking your, like down your cheeks and down your arms to your elbows and the palms. All this is generating delta waves, which heals, clears trauma out the brain. It's self-soothing. It releases oxytocin, releases GABA, which is a very relaxing amino acid in the brain, and balances. Did I say releases oxytocin and balances serotonin? Yeah. So anything like that, but really it's about helping the person be aware of what they are feeling in the here and now, because actually they are feeling their feelings. Like you get someone in group therapy going, I can't feel my feelings, and you say, well, you are, it's just not the one you think you should be feeling. You're feeling really angry right now. And it's like, so helping them really be aware in the here and now. And this is it actually. So people have lots of unconscious or defense mechanisms stopping them feeling what they're feeling in the here and now, like the wall of humor when they're smiling when they say something painful. If you say, just take a breath, stop smiling, feel your body, then they can feel the feeling, or a wall of words. Someone says, oh, they start to get tearful, and then they talk themselves well away from the feeling, and if you stop them and say, just stop a moment, please, take a breath, what do you feel? Boom, they're into their feeling, So learning to see and sense when the person's in the feeling and getting them to stop and be with it is what I do, as to help people with that. And but also with the positive feelings, noticing them and being with them. Because if you sit with a positive feeling for a minute or so, feeling it where it is in your body, breathing into it, it builds resilience in the brain, it rewires neural pathways, it builds resources, So
Beautiful. Well, we're coming to an end now, Alistair, and just really honor you for the work you're doing. Is there any last thing you'd like to share with people before we finish?
Well, there's hope, however hopeless you might feel. If you have an addiction or if you're in despair, just, ask for some help. If it's addiction, there's all these 12-step fellowships, there's treatment centers, there's therapists. I've got my, you can contact me for suggestions as well. I think Piers will be putting that in the information below the video, the podcast when it goes out. Yeah, there's always hope. So just ask for help. That's what I tend to end with, really. And deep down, we've got this wholeness that's there, even if it's like the sun behind clouds, it's there, So
Thank you, Alistair. I think you're very inspiring to have been through the journey you've been through, and to be in the space and to be doing the work you're doing. So, I think there is hope. So you really show that.
Well, thanks, and same to you, Piers. You're inspirational as well. So it's been really nice to meet you, and thanks for this space to share together, and spread the blessings.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you so much. So yes, I'll put into the description Alistair's website details, so please do get in touch with Alistair. Yeah, he does amazing work and workshops, so please do reach out to him. And yeah, thank you again, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks, Piers.
Okay, take care, Alistair.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.